Thank you all for coming. It's my, I am Behruz Qamari Tabrizi. I'm the director of Bijan and Sharmin Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. It's my great pleasure today to welcome Professor Bahar Davary, who is a professor of religious studies and also affiliated member of the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of San Diego. Among so many different things that Professor Davary does, perhaps the most important so far is to bring Bahar from San Diego to Princeton in this beautiful day here. Very appropriate with the name, Bahar Davary. Professor Davary's research and publications are broadly within the field of comparative study of religion with a focus on Islamic studies. Her first book, highly recommended, Women and the Quran, Study in Islamic Hermeneutics, which came out in 2009, focuses on the development, continuity, and change in the portrayal of women with an emphasis on how the identity of women throughout history of Islam has been determined by androcentric interpretations of the sacred text. She argues that the history of the mediation of the text occasionally refers to a few women interpreters. However, they have remained on the periphery. Her later work centers on the development of Muslim feminist scholarship, especially as it grapples with the challenges of Orientalism, colonialism, patriarchal Islamism, and Neo-Orientalism. Dr. Davary has published several articles in academic journals, encyclopedia entries, and other forums. Professor Davary's latest book, Eco-Theology and Love, the convergent poetics of Sohrab Sepehri and James Baldwin, points to the interrelation of religion, poetry, ecology from a comparative perspective with an emphasis on decoloniality. This work shows how authors Sohrab Sepehri and James Baldwin sought social justice by building their work on love, an authentic way of knowing the world based on interconnectedness, interconnected knowledge of the self. The layers of depth in Sepehri and Baldwin's works and their immediacy for our time has yet to be fully understood. But through eco-theology and love, Davary takes a significant step toward achieving such a fuller understanding. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Davary.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me okay? Salam arz mikonam be hamagi. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for being here. I want to especially thank Dr. Qamari Tabrizi for the invitation and the arrangement made by the staff of the Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani for having me here from thousands of miles away. It's great to be here. It's a pleasure to be here and share a little glimpse of what I did in this book. I essentially look at it as a book talk. So it is a little essence of what I try to cover in this recently published book, trying to work the convergences between Sohrab Sepehri and James Baldwin might seem, and in a way it is, a difficult task. The two are quite different in many ways. I don't know to what extent people are familiar with the two figures, so I briefly introduce each, and then I will try to elaborate on how I see convergences between the two. I assume that Sohrab Sepehri is more familiar to our audience here. He was born in Rome in 1928, died in 1980 at a young age of 51, during which he produced a collection of 8 books called 8 Books, Hasht Kitab, symbolically titled, because that in that number 8 itself, Sohrab, who was familiar with not only cultures of ancient Iran, cultures of pre-Islamic Iran, culture of Zoroastrian Iran, culture of Islamic Iran, but also with cultures of the East, Far East, Japan, cultures of indigenous people of Africa, with Taoism, with Confucianism, with Shinto, with Buddhism, and all religious symbolism of the world, in fact. So in this number 8, he's actually saying something. 8 is not only the number of the gates of heaven, but it's also the sacred number in China. That's why when the Olympics were held, it was on the 8th of August, which is the 8th month, at 8 minutes and 8 seconds. 8 is a sacred number in many cultures. In Judaism, it is the letter H, which stands for number 8, and that's for the word Hay, which means life. Enough of that. But also what I focused on in understanding Sepehri, which I think, and I thought anybody who writes a book sees a gap in the existing literature, I suppose. And that's what I saw in the existing literature on Sohrab, that his awareness of religions of the world was not addressed in many of the works that was done. Even if they saw him as a neo-mystic, a neo-Sufi, they did not realize his awareness of all the cultures of the world and the symbolic connotations in his poetry. The most famous of the learned among those who know his work is Sirus Shamisa, who thought of him as someone who was close to Krishnamurti and therefore assumed him to be kind of Zen Buddhist because of his references to Buddha. And I don't think that's the case. I want to focus on the cosmopolitanism of Sohrab in terms of religious imagery, in terms of religious symbolism that he uses throughout. And I also want to insist that he was truly a Muslim, in a sense that Shahab Ahmad talks about being a Muslim, in interest in the paideia of Islam, which is far broad and inclusive than what we imagine when we hear Islam today, whether it is here in the United States or whether it is in the Islamic Republic of Iran. I'm not talking about that Islam. I'm talking about the Islam of the people, the pillars of Mazhab Ishq, the religion of love. I'm talking about the Islam of Maulana Jalaluddin. I'm talking about the Islam of Fariduddin Attar, of Sa'di, of Hafiz, and the other pillars of Mazhab Ishq. And it is in that tradition that I view Sepehri as one of the contemporary 20th century pillars of Mazhab Ishq, on his focus on love. I'll come back to this focus on love. James Baldwin, who is also probably very well known to any audience in the United States, an essayist, a novelist, also an activist of the civil rights movement, one who had to escape his country, his home. He was born in Harlem in 1924, very close to the time where Sepehri was born, far away in Iran, in Qom, in fact. And he died in 1986. Both of them died of cancer, sadly, at a young age. James Baldwin was also 63 when he died. He has produced a host of works, from novels to essays to long essays, or the book-length essays, from Go Tell It on the Mountain, which is his kind of autobiography in fiction, to The Evidence of Things Not Seen, to The Fire Next Time, to Giovanni's Room, and Tell Me When the Train Is Gone, and many others. Before I get further into talking about the convergences of James Baldwin and Sohrab Sepehri, I want to read these 2 quotes, which helps us situate the way and the lens I see through these 2 poets, because both of them were poets. James Baldwin was also a poet, in addition to being an essayist and a novelist. Joy Harjo, who is a first Indigenous Nobel laureate, says, poetry has always been the language of the prophets, the language of truth-tellers. Maria Zambrano, the Spaniard philosopher, who wrote, in a way, the epistemology of liberation of her time, says, the mission of the poet in a period of defeat and permanent crisis is to make of poetry a new place for accessing hidden reality. And here, when I talk about poets, I don't simply mean those who write good rhyme. By poetry, all of these people, Joy Harjo, Maria Zambrano, Sohrab Sepehri, James Baldwin, meant someone who sees the world differently, someone who sees things in the world that others don't see, who has the responsibility and sees in his, her integrity as an artist to bring about awareness. So at some point in the introduction of my book, I say that Sohrab Sepehri saw his book in a way as a sacred text in a way that brings about awareness, brings about a shock and awe to the audience, to the reader, if one is attentive to that shock and awe that he brings about in his poetry. Let's see, where is the thing? Here we go. The title I gave might seem lofty. I don't mean the talk to be a lofty talk, but I began with an introductory definition of humanism in Encyclopedia Britannica, referring to humanitas. Humanitas meant the development of human virtue in all of its form, not only qualities as benevolence, compassion, mercy, but also more assertive characteristics as fortitude, judgment, prudence, eloquence, and even love of honor. Consequently, the possessor of humanitas could not be merely a sedentary and isolated philosopher, or man or woman of letters, but was of necessity a participant in active life. Just as action without insight was held to be aimless and barbaric, insight without action was rejected as barren and imperfect. Humanitas called for a fine balance of action and contemplation. If I go by that definition, I would say Sohrab Sepehri and James Baldwin were both humanists, and it is by that definition that I would claim that both were a form of new humanism. Of course, I would like to also say that they were not humanists in the humanist tradition of Petrarch, Machiavelli, or Erasmus from the European tradition that tends to ask whether human is a creature of earth on earth or a god on earth. Or as Michael Gillespie puts it, the first of all things for man was man. I don't think in that sense, neither of the two were signing up to that form of European humanism of the Renaissance, or for that matter, that of existentialists like Sartre or Camus. Because James Baldwin, in his book No Name in the Street, which was published in 1972, said this directly to Camus. So he was conversant with Camus, conversant with Fanon, because he lived in France. He left for France in 1940s, late 1940s. He left for Paris with $40 in his pocket with a one-way ticket. This was before his friends, Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King were assassinated. He came back again, but he left again, not to escape, but to be free to write, because in Harlem he couldn't, in the US he couldn't. So he left for Paris, then he lived in St. Paul de Vence for a long time. He lived in Turkey, he lived in Switzerland. So much of his life he lived in exile. Again, not to escape, he was very much in contact with what was going on racially in the US. He had never left his people behind in a way that some, like Eldridge Cleaver of the Black Panther, had accused him of being just another liberal who is worried about the consciousness of white people. His body of work shows that he was not. So his tireless lectures, talks here or there, and the evidence of all of his writing shows that he was never separated from that. So he said, for Camus, European humanism appears to expire at the European gates and doesn't apply to the Oriental or the African. I'll come back to that word Oriental in a minute. I want to quote a few things because his body of work is so vast. Neither do I claim to be an expert on Baldwin, nor am I able to summarize his body of work in a, you gave me 35 minutes, 35 to 40 minute talk, but I want to read a few quotes of him that might be useful in getting a glimpse into his mindset. He said, once you examine what the word racial mean, and I say this because oftentimes people reduce him to be someone who talks about race issues only, who talks about homosexual issues, sexuality issues only. He says this, once you examine what the word racial mean, after all, everybody is a race of one kind or another. We're not talking about racial prejudice. We're talking about structure of power, the structure of power which has the right and duty to tell other people who they are for very dubious reason, and it has nothing to do with race. It has something to be the dominant power over people for dubious reasons. Then he was asked, Giovanni's Rome is about homosexuality, and it's such a daring book because nobody was writing about homosexuality back then, and you dare to write that. He said in response to this question in an interview, he says, it's not about homosexuality at all. It's about what happens to you if you can't love anybody. If you can't love anybody, you're dangerous. You have no way of learning humility, no way of learning that other people suffer, no way of learning how to use your suffering and theirs to get from one place to another. I'm quoting these so that you can see how philosophically minded he was, this poet, novelist, essayist, and civil rights activist. I want to claim that Sohrab Sepehri was also poetic, someone who had poetic reason, as Maria Zambrano puts it, a Spanish philosopher. He had poetic reason, and he spoke about deep ideas, but in a very simple language, in a way that it has become proverbalized in Farsi, in Iran, and yet the depth of it is sometimes not quite understood. I want to claim here that he was a poet of Orient, and I insisted on using the term Orient because Joseph Meeker, when he wrote about the tragedy of what the Western civilization has done to the environment and the bankruptcy of Western civilization in that regard, says, before you leave the Western intellectual tradition, which is bankrupt when it comes to the environment and the destruction of it, don't go to the Oriental or the primitive. That's the language he uses. Don't go to the Oriental or the primitive. Go to the minority report of the West, the writings of Dante and of Francis of Assisi, both of whom are admirable figures, especially for me, Francis of Assisi. Yet I want to go to a figure of Orient and a figure who's African for obvious reasons. So I claim that he was a poet of the Orient, a modern mystic, a solitary character with a profound understanding of the Occident. And I say that claim not just by his poetry, but by the 3 essays in the Blue Book, where he talks in the conversation with the professor, he talks so proficiently about art history, not just of the East, but of the West and of Africa and of the Far East as well. His simplicity of language also continued in his art, which you'll see in some of the images here, as well as his life. His life was quite simple. He lived a life of what do we call it these days? An ascetic, but minimalist. A minimalist life. So if he read books, he would give it away. He wouldn't keep it. He had a small bookshelf always going on, but he would give them away. He would read all the art newspapers in French and English, according to his friends and contemporaries, in those languages, and he would give it away. He has translated poetry from Japanese and Chinese, probably by the use of English and French. I don't know if he knew Japanese or Chinese. At a young age, in his 20s, into Farsi, which were published in magazines. In his poetry, he foregrounded the connectedness of humans with other beings. This is very much seen throughout all of his poetry. He rejects all forms of hegemony and oppression, colonialism, militarism, and consumerism. He rejects scientism, not science, but scientism. He rejects anthroparchy, that everything has to be done for the benefit of humans and humans alone, and androcentrism, that everything should be done for the benefit of men and centered around men. Attention to the importance of the relation between humans and other beings is very central. He focuses on the importance of plants, mineral and natural elements. And again, when you look at the Blue Book, you'll see in the footnotes the books that he has read and he has quoted. So he would have read, for example, The Life of Plants, which had just come out that year, and he had quoted it, footnoted it in his writings, which was published posthumously. He was a poet who viewed the world as a mystery that humbles us. Now, there was another slide. I mentioned briefly the humanism of the Renaissance, but I also want to point to two quotes. One by Mohammed Arkoun, who wrote in L'Humanisme Arabe this: Adab, as a holistic approach to education and learning, a pluralistic project that has at times been silenced by what he calls hegemonic reason or dominating orthodoxies, reading religions not as dogmas, but rather a way of foregrounding issues such as consciousness, eschatology, and revelation as a springboard for mythical or symbolic thinking. I see Sohrab's work in this category, that he was not a-religious as some would assume, that he did not reject metaphysical ideas in a way that some have quoted. Hamid Dabashi's Persian literature humanism assigns a privileged place for humans in the universe. Through the term adab, he associates the privileging of humans with a cosmopolitan worldliness, and he puts Sohrab Sepehri in that category, in a cosmopolitan worldliness, which I wish to separate Sohrab Sepehri from, even though he was a cosmopolitan. He belonged to this world. But he was not a worldly person. I see him more as a modern mystic who is very much connected to metaphysics, if I may put a poet into that position. In order for us to see Sepehri's poetry, and many of you may have seen his poetry in that way, I want to point to a few things environmentally to situate us where we are, to bring our minds to the situation in which we are when we talk about ecological disasters. Humans have only been around for about 300,000 of the 4.6 billion year life of the Earth. In that time, we have established ourselves as a major geological force on this planet. Destruction of forests, pollution of our waters and atmospheres are not new phenomena in human history. What is new is the speed and force by which we engage in acts of pollution and destruction. The images are to help us see that destruction. 10 million tons of oil is spilled in the oceans annually. 8 million tons of plastic is dumped in the ocean per year. 239,000 tons of that are microplastics. They go deep, deep, deep into the ocean. There are 5 garbage patches in the Great Pacific, the GPGP, Great Pacific Garbage Patch, between California and Hawaii is the size of Texas. It goes deep 14 feet under, and there are microplastic that are eaten by fish and other sea creatures. Half of the world tropical forests have been cleared. Since the 1990, 80 million acres of forest have been destroyed. Between 2015 and 2022, the destruction of forest has been about 10 million acres a year. The pandemic slowed that down a bit, but we are catching up again. Of the 8 billion people living on the planet, 1 billion do not have access to clean drinking water. 5 million die each year as a result. Half of them are children. Water, I used to say, will be one of the sources of international conflict. I should say now water is one of the sources of international conflict. And here, in this context, in the 60s, early 60s, a Persian poet comes to talk about these things. Now, in that setting, he says, perhaps our job is to run between the morning glory and the century in pursuit of the song of truth. He says, in this home, I am close to the damp anonymity of the grass. I can hear the breathing sound of the flower beds and the sound of darkness as it trickles down from the leaves. I can hear the water sneezing out of every pore of the rock and the drip, drip, dripping of swallows from the ceiling of the spring. Chik chik chalchala saqf bahar. And I can hear the clear sound of solitude opening and closing its window. He said, I'm close to the beginning of the earth. I feel the pulse of the flowers. I am familiar with the wet destiny of water and the green habit of trees. Then he gives us, unlike what some interpreters of his work say, that he did not give morality, and of course the work of poet is not to be a moralist, but he does have the responsibility and integrity of an artist to bring about awareness. He says, I've never known two poplars to be enemies. I have never seen a willow selling its shade to the ground. The elm lets its branch to the crow for free. Here are some proclamation. Let us not step over the canon of the grass, and let us not say that the glowworm is unaware of the garden's insight. I do not know why it is said that the horse is a noble creature, that dove is a beautiful bird. And these are some of the things that I categorize in his, not just eco-poetics, which means a poet who is aware of the condition of the earth and condition of us in relationship to everything, but also one who is aware of condition of us with the truth, with a capital T perhaps, with the reality, with a capital R. I do not know why nobody keeps a vulture in a cage. I do not know why clover flowers are considered inferior to red tulips. Eyes should be washed. Words should be washed. Here's where action comes in. It's not just about beautiful poetry. It's not just about somebody sitting in their aesthetic room writing for their own pleasure, but it's about being aware, bringing awareness. Let's not wish the housefly chased off nature's fingertips. Some of you are recognizing his art. Some of these pictures that you're seeing on the side are his paintings. Let's not wish the housefly chased off nature's fingertip, and let us not wish the leopard expelled from being. And let us remember that if there were no worms, something would be missing in life. This is in the 1960s, before the environmental movement, before Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Something would be missing in life, and if there were no caterpillars, the law of the trees would suffer, and if there was no death, our hand would keep searching for something. And let us remember that before corals, there was a vacuum in the thought of the seas. Some of you will recognize this is from his famous long poem, Sadaya Paya Aab, the sound of water's footfall. I must remember to quickly fetch every butterfly that falls in the water. I must remember not to insult the way of the earth. And he actually did that. There are two documentaries in Farsi that I encourage, if you have the time, to see. In one of them, one of his artist friends said that she was actually making a mockery of Sohrab, who they've called everyone to come have lunch, and Sohrab was trying to save a butterfly out of the pool of the yard. And he said Sohrab is trying to bring back to life this butterfly. So this was actually his life. His childhood friends, Mahmoud Afil Sufi, in the stories of their childhood together, writes that every time we walked in the field of Gulistan and other parts of Kashan, if Sohrab saw a line of ants, he would change his path so that he does not inadvertently step on them. If he came across a peasant, a farmer, he would talk to them. He would ask them what they need to bring to them. So he was actually practicing actively what he preached in his poetry. He says in The Expanse of Green, which he wrote in 1965, there are things I do not know. I know that if I cut a grass, I will die. This sounds radical, doesn't it? If I cut a grass, I'll die. This is extreme environmentalism, quite radical and environmentalism. I don't have time to go into this, but in the book, I connected to a tradition of the Bishnoi in India, who are still today a small community in India and who follow the Bishnua 29 proclamations of their guru. This is a sect which is kind of ambivalent between Islam and Hinduism. There are both Muslims and Hindus who participated in following Guru Jambeshwara. But I am suspecting that perhaps Sohrab, in his sojourn in India, which much of his travels were by land, by the way, he did not get on a plane and go to this country or that country. He did not only travel to Europe, he had long sojourns in India, he had long stay in Japan, and when he went there, he lived with the people. He did not go to stay in a 5-star or even 4-star or 3-star hotel. He lived really with the people. And I suspect that he might have come across the Bishnoi people for whom cutting any greenery, even dried pieces of wood, is forbidden. And so this radical environmentalism may be inspired by them as early as 1965, again, before any form of environmental movement had existed. One of his poems that was criticized by another very prominent poem, Ahmad Shamlu, and another very important poem, Akhavan Sales, was his poem called Water. In that, he says, "Let us not muddy the water. Maybe down the river a dove is drinking water, or on a distant land a little bird is washing her wings, or maybe in a nearby village a pitcher is getting filled with water. Let us not muddy the water. Maybe the flowing water is passing by a tree to take away sadness from the heart." I have juxtaposed it with pictures of what you recognize as water protectors, who are mainly the tribal indigenous people. The slogan on the t-shirt of this young Native American girl is Meniwekoni, water is life. This was in protest to the DAPL, Dakota pipeline, which was about a little over 1,000-mile pipeline between North Dakota and Illinois, which threatened the water resources of the indigenous people mostly, and all of us. I am connecting this not by assumption, but I'm again connecting Sohrab's poem, Water, to the native people. Because of what I read in his Blue Book, where he showed awareness of the writings of indigenous people, of the traditions of indigenous people, the way they treated water, the way they saw sanctity in water and the symbolism of water and its sanctity in various traditions. He said, "How pure are the people up the river?" Akhavan Saleh said, "Who are the people up the river? Is it Russian? Is it Japan? Is it America?" You can see how far it was from what Sohrab had in mind. "May their water springs remain generating. I haven't seen their village. No doubt at the feet of their fences there's a sign of God. What a village it must be. May its gardens and paths be filled with lovely songs. The people up the river understand water. They have not muddied it. Let us not muddy the water." This is the prophetic vision of a poet who sees the future in a way that no one else does, in a way that is not limited to the location of Iran in the time in which Sohrab Sepehri lived, which is in the aftermath of World War II, and of course the issue of the coup d'etat 28 مرداد, the coup d'etat against Mossadegh and all of that. But his mind, while aware of the local events going on in his homeland, it was also global, and he had his eye on bigger, important things that affect all of life, in a way that Hirmand is dried up, in a way that Karun is dried up, in a way that Urumiyeh is dried up, and in a way that it would be a human disaster, not just for Iran and for all the area that surrounds it. I claim that he is decolonial, his thinking is decolonial, that he's anti-militaristic, that he's anti-hegemony, all kinds of hegemony. So here's a few verses that I offer in support of that. "In these dark alleys, I fear the multiplication of indecision and a match. I fear the cement surface of the century." The pictures are help to understand how I interpret the cement surface of the century. Let me not fear cities whose black dirt is the pasture for cranes. Open me like a door to the descent of the pear in this age of the ascent of steel. Often he uses imagery like the pear, which is again a symbol. In various cultures it means different things, but generally it means abundance, it means fruitfulness. Open me like a door to the descent of the pear in this age of the ascent of steel. Put me to sleep under a tree branch, far away from the night of the collision of the metals. Wake me up if the discoverer of the mine of the morning arrives at the time we're mining and disrupting the earth in a way that what leaves is not going to produce anything for human survival. Tell me about the bombs that were dropped as I was asleep. Tell me about the cheeks wet with tears. Tell me what innocent goods arrived at the ports. What science uncovered the positive tune of gunpowder. And here's anti-militarism, anti-structures of power. Let me see, I'm close to the end of my time. I'll wrap up soon. I want to say what kind of humanism Baldwin and Sepehri had. While the two seem radically different in a way, I tried to say that James Baldwin's work was not simply anti-racial. It was not simply anti-homophobic, but rather it was anti-hegemony, anti-global dominance, and so was Sepehri's work in very different forms, in very different regions. But what connects their humanism together is that their humanism, which is not of the humanism of Erasmus, Machiavelli, or Petrarch, or Sartre or Camus, is the humanism of the religion of love, the humanism that's centered around love. And of course, he has so much about love that I don't have time to read here. But here's a few quotes again from James Baldwin on love. Love takes off the mask that we fear we cannot live without and know we cannot live within. And then he explains, what does he mean by love? Because Hannah Arendt wrote to him and said, I'm disturbed by your use of the word love because love is so fuzzy and sentimental. He says, I use the word love here not merely in the personal sense, but as a state of being or as a state of grace, not in the infantile American sense of being made happy, but in the tough and universal sense of quest and daring and growth. Then he talks about issue of color. Color is not a personal reality, but a political reality. And love is a self-examination, a measure of our understanding, of our humanity and our complexity. Love offers the only way to a moral commitment to our salvation. As Baldwin was very much concerned with salvation. He was a preacher at the age 14 in a Pentecostal church. His father was a preacher too, so he, in the footsteps of his father, he became a preacher at 14, then he left the church at 17, but he never left Christ. He tells us what he means by living in accordance with Christ, not with the church. Love offers the only way to a moral commitment to our salvation. Salvation is not separation. It is the beginning of union with all that is, or has been, or will ever be. Love opens up the rusted lid of the heart. There's absolutely no salvation without love. Anybody feels roomy here when you read Love opens up the rusted lid of the heart? It's very much, to me, resonates the poetry of Maulana Jalaluddin. Love is a battle. Love is a war. Love is a growing up. And the reason why I selected the imagery of a mirror, mirror again is a symbol in vast cultures of the world with various meanings. Sometimes it reflects clearly, sometimes it reflects a very ambiguous shadow of a person. So Sohrab says, Aine shikastam ta sarshar to basham va man. I broke the mirror so that I become filled with you and with me. James Baldwin says, we perceive by means of the kaleidoscope. This quote is from his book, The Evidence of Things Not Seen. He says, we perceive by means of the kaleidoscope, mirror of this life. This means that our ability to perceive is at once tyrannized by our expectations and at war with them. Our expectations are revealed in our habits, our manner, our defeats, terrors, genuine or imagined triumphs, risk being more visible to others than to ourselves. For that mirror on the wall, hears no questions and answers none. The light is always changing in that mirror. This light will not permit us to forget that we are mortal, which means that we are all connected, which complicates the judgment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was so fascinating. Let me see if we have like 15 minutes for your questions. I'll take the questions.
Thank you so much, beautiful talk. I was wondering if you could say something about the translations. Are these your translations?
Yes, thank you. Translations are mine. Yes, thank you.
Very good. That was my question too.
And I guess a follow-up. So, and in the presentation especially, pairing the images with the translations, I was trying to think what that does. Obviously, it's very compelling, but it also limits the translation, I want to say, right? Like the semantic range of the words or the metaphoric, what the words can conjure. You are drawing our attention upwards to these images. So I was wondering if you can comment on that, about how you think about words and images.
I'm interested in what you say because it's something to put this PowerPoint together and it's something to look at it from a viewer's point of view and see what you see. I didn't hear you clearly. Did you say that it limits it or?
I was wondering.
Yes.
That was my question.
Well, it depends. I wanted to bring his art too, even though I know very, very little to nothing about his art and his style. I've read here or there. And in the Blue Book, when he talks about art and what he thinks, and of course, I'm in love, as you have noticed, with his imagery of the trees, with how he makes central the tree trunk, and the village is a little tiny thing in the back. So gives centrality to what is more important, because as we read in his poetry, why do we have this hierarchy of things? Who says that humans are superior? He's actually opposing the idea that humans are ashraf makhluqat, the supreme being in all of creation. He's messing in a way with that idea. So he's not humanist. That's why I say he's not humanist in the sense that Renaissance humanism was. So the reason why I bring, because I think in his art, and some have said that this is not mine, but some have said that his poetry continues in his art and his art swims in a way in his poetry. So that's the reason why I bring his art in. But when he talks about Muddy the Water, that poem has been so simplistically interpreted that those who critiqued him for being an aristocratic Buddha boy, that's the late Reza Barahini who called him the aristocratic Buddha boy, would call him someone who is Murafah Bidard, because he was from a falling down aristocratic family. He was the great-grandson of the person who wrote Nasakh wa Tawarikh. His grandmother was a poet. His mother was a learned, avid reader who read to them Hafiz and not only the poets, but also many classics of Persian literature and Sufi literature. They read Tazkirat al-Awliya and all kinds of difficult texts as children. Around the table, around the kursi, they would read those things. So what I wanted to do with those imageries was to bring in a way the anti-colonial, anti-hegemony, eco-theological, eco-poetic aspects of his poetry, which was not understood by Akhavan Sales, by Shamlu, and many others, Barahini included.
First of all, thank you for your very captivating talk. And obviously, you didn't have the time to go too much into Baldwin during the lecture, but if you could maybe expand a bit more on what is gained in the book by including both Sohrab and Baldwin within your framework of analysis versus, for instance, focusing squarely on Sohrab and contextualizing them within 20th century Iranian urbanization and industrialization, or even the impact and encounters of his travels on his poetry. So focusing on one instead of what is gained by reading Baldwin also?
Thank you for that question. In a way, I have to say the book wrote itself. Baldwin introduced himself into the book without me thinking about it before. So this was not me writing an outline and say, okay, I want to compare these two figures. As I mentioned in the beginning, these two figures in many ways seem very far away from one another. I think what is central between the two is their focus and understanding of love and our connectedness to one another. To be African American in the United States and to say we have to love, love is the only human possibility, is an amazing thing in my view. So the reason why I didn't, it was when I was writing the book, George Floyd was killed, Ahmaud Arbery was killed, and more. And I couldn't not address it in some way. So without me wanting, the convergence happened. I started rereading Baldwin. I started rereading If Beale Street Would Talk, if the Evidence of Things Not Seen, which is about framing Black people, which is about, again, about self-reflection for Black people and white people to come together in love, to understand that what we see in the mirror, what we fear in the mirror, is us, and in the discovery of the self, which is what actually the pillars of Mazhab Ishq, the religion of love, are after. Maulana is all about knowing oneself. I felt in the writings of Baldwin also that trend of we have to know ourselves. We have to know ourselves to know others, and in that reconnection with one another and realization that if someone is oppressing the other person, they're oppressing themselves as well. That I find in a way Baldwin coming in also with Maria Zambrano, who lived under Franco and he lived under exile, who critiqued the rational dominant way of thinking in the West by raison poetica, the poetic reason. So I found in Baldwin the poetic reason, not the rational mind in his expression of love, and I found in Sepehri the same thing, and in a way the book wrote itself. I couldn't help it. Thank you.
Can I just follow up on that a little bit? I saw your hand. Yeah. Although I totally agree with you on the way you read Baldwin and the way he goes beyond racial politics, politics of sexuality, and introducing different kinds of humanity and humanism. In writing. In personality, there is such a distinct kind of difference between Sepehri and Baldwin. I see, well, maybe I'm mistaken on that. I see Baldwin as someone very assertive and very determined to drive the point home to a larger audiences. While the way I see Sepehri is that he really cherishes his solitude and he puts ideas there and then removes himself from the decimation of those ideas.
I see what you mean. Baldwin is enraged because to be Black in America, 1924, born in Harlem, at the juncture of being poor, being Black, and being gay. Imagine that. He was enraged. He said in one interview, I'm not in despair. I can't tell the children not to have any hope, but I am enraged of the way this world is. And he would be enraged still to this day. So yes, that's in that sense, you can say they're very different, but of course Baldwin has his ascetic side too. Why did he go to Saint Paul de Vence? Anybody has been to Saint Paul de Vence? Little tiny village, now it's very touristic, but little tiny village in a little home in Saint Paul de Vence with his little typewriter and his albums, jazz, writing away. He fled because he was enraged, and you're right, when we see him, we see in his writings, he's not enraged. We don't see rage in his novels. It's very centered, but of course when he speaks in his interviews, but even then, he's very poetically philosophical. His language the way he talks is like poetry, more so when he talks in interviews than his writings. But yes, there may be slightly, and because of location, right? Sohrab didn't have that. Sohrab didn't grow up as the other in his own hometown in a way that James Baldwin did. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. So I'm wondering about the comparison between Baldwin and Sepehri, or especially around the sort of different prophetic traditions, right? So there's like the Afro-American prophetic tradition that Baldwin's in, and his throughout his writings and also in the famous debate with Buckley, he says that he feels like a Jeremiah, right?
Yes.
There's the and so the form is that of the Jeremiah. Mm-hmm. Baldwin is also someone who is sort of figuring himself within a Christian eschatology. So the fall has happened. Mm-hmm. And what we are in the middle, right? And you see this in the fire next time, that the hymn is basically like looking forth to the apocalypse, right? It's revelation, right? It's a revelation. Mm-hmm. And so I'm thinking of that in the context of the environmental movement preceding Rachel Carson in the United States, where beginning with the transcendentalists, there was a kind of unreflexive sense of awe at the beauties of nature that was tightly entangled with settler colonialism. So it was like, in the congressional hearings from like the 20s or so, when they were establishing the national parks, the idea was that, well, what makes this land beautiful is that it's uninhabited splendor, except that they were inhabited, right, by like indigenous people. And so it was like, right, and so there was this kind of way in which, if you think of the Jeremiad in that context, mm-hmm. you see that it's actually not like, in fact, it's an implicit critique of unreflexive wonder in the face of the beauties of creation. And the Jeremiad is actually saying, no, I'm here to tell you that this world is ugly, and to look it in the face. Now I'm thinking of that with Sepehri, and I'm thinking of a particularly different tradition. I'm thinking, for example, that before Sepehri, you had Hidayat writing one of the first essays on vegetarianism. Mm-hmm. That he wrote those essays talking about this kind of humanism, except that it was contaminated by a hatred for Arabs. Mm-hmm. Right? Now, I wonder if Hidayat's early appreciation of like the unity of creation and this sort of justification of vegetarianism that is also sort of contaminated by this kind of thing, how we might then think of Sepehri's moments where he is unreflexively having this sense of wonder at creation within that narrative, if we then contrast it with what's happening in the United States, right? So Baldwin, in the face, the Jeremiah that troubles a history of just being like, nature is beautiful, but saying, no, the world is ugly, to these like very beautiful, poetic sort of, look at how, like, let's go back this time in which there was purity, in which it was because I see the things he's saying about the people by the river, but I'm also thinking of the debates of, like, that's like the noble savage, right? So I don't see that I don't see like that as not like unproblematic. And so perhaps maybe what happens if we bring Baldwin's Jeremiah and have him actually confront the moments, that the kind of unreflexive appreciation of natural beauty in the face of this particular history.
Well,
Go ahead, please.
There's one more question there.
Okay.
We can continue that conversation later over lunch, but let me just see what one more question is.
Mine is much shorter.
Yeah, because we are actually out of time, but let's have one more question and then we'll continue the conversation later.
But I'd rather you kind of dovetails with Navid's point. You mentioned something about Sohrab's ability, talent to say things that would take place many years later, see things well into the future with the environmentalist movement and so forth. I recall this famous poem. It says, "I see no color that will speak to me. Bitter patience, morning is near." And that kind of talks to me about what's going on in today's in this country, and people struggle for freedom and self-determination and so forth. What other prophecies can you mention that you could draw from this poetry?
Well, my focus is mostly on eco-theology. That's the title of the book, Eco-Theology and Love. The idea, and if I can tie it to the earlier beautiful comment and question, is that I don't see Sepehri only wondering about the beauty of nature. In fact, one of the chapters is beyond nature poetry. He's not simply saying, and I don't at all see the idea of a noble savage. I see him reading the tradition of the indigenous people, saying, there's something sacred here. I adhere to this sacred thing. Saying the sense of the sacred that I see in this tradition, because he was very much into the sense of the sacred, not just beauty of nature. In a way, many articles written, dissertations written about Sepehri in Farsi that compare him to Walt Whitman and Emerson and Thoreau and all that, without any of them mentioning that their work was in turn very much influenced by the work of Shamsuddin Hafiz Shiraz. That it was very much influenced by Sa'di. Emerson called himself Sa'di. He nicknamed himself Sa'di. He was that much influenced by Sa'di, in whose work also nature is not just beauty, nature is sacred. One of the other poems of Sohrab is, he points to a leaf and it says, here's a sign, here's the point, the sense of the sacred. So it's not just beauty of nature, it's not just a noble savage. He has deep respect for indigenous traditions, for the sacrality of earth and the interconnectedness and the indigenous traditions in Africa, in Australia, in Native Americans, in Canada, the first people, all of those people who have in their religious tradition seen the interconnection between all beings, which is present in a sense in the people of the religion of love, the people who assert Mazhab Ishq, Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, Sanai Ghaznavi, Hafiz and Sa'di. So I call him, both of them, this was the connection between the two, I call them both pillars of Mazhab Ishq, even though geographically they're far, far apart. They look totally different, and they come from different backgrounds. Thank you.
Join me in thanking